One of the favorite meals that Jews eat on Shabbat is called cholent. Cholent is a type of stew that is put into the oven completely raw on Friday and allowed to cook overnight until one takes it out of the oven on Shabbat morning, and it's hot and it's fresh and it's tasty. And there are many different types of recipes for cholent. Some people put in meat, some people put in cholent, some have a vegetarian type of a cholent, some people put in rice. It's absolutely delicious and it's very, very tasty. Where did this idea of cholent come about? Well, the idea really comes from this week's parasha. Moshe comes down from the mountain after he's been there for 3 periods of 40 days, and he instructs the Jewish people about the making of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which is an incredible project. It's the building of the first temple ever. But before he tells them about making donations to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle, he tells them about Shabbat. The idea being is that as important as it is to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, one cannot break Shabbat in order to do it. And he gathered them together and he says that 6 days you can work, on the 7th day you have to rest. And then he says, Lo tavaru eish b'chol moshvotechem b'yom HaShabbat. You are not allowed to make a fire in all of your dwellings on the Shabbat day. And the Talmud wonders why it is that Moshe singles out that one particular activity of Shabbat. There are 39 activities that are prohibited on Shabbat. Why did he choose making a fire? And Nachmanides explains that the reason why he did it is because he wanted to contrast Shabbat with Yom Tov. On the festivals such as Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, one is allowed to cook. One is allowed to make a fire. Whereas Moshe had to say to the Jewish people, that is not allowed on Shabbat. On Shabbat, you're not allowed to make a fire, you're not allowed to cook. And therefore, all of the cooking has to be done before. And this is where the idea of the cholent came. You couldn't actively cook it, so you got all of the ingredients ready, and you left it on the fire to cook over Shabbat until it was ready. In fact, the Code of Jewish Law tells us that it's a mitzvah to have hot food on Shabbat, and not to have cold food for the meal that is eaten during the day. Why? Because there were a sect of Jews called the Karaites. The Karaites broke away from regular Judaism, and they believed only in the written law, not in the oral law. And in the written law it says, you're not allowed to have a fire in your home on Shabbat. So the Karaites took that very, very literally. And they didn't have any fire or any light in their home on Shabbat. On Friday night they sat in the dark. If it was cold, they were freezing cold. The oral law tells us that what that means is you're not allowed to ignite a fire. But you can certainly have a fire going from before. You can have food cooking from before. And therefore, says the Code of Jewish Law, it's a great mitzvah to actually have hot food, because you're showing people who don't believe in the oral law that what you believe in is incorrect. When the Torah says you're not allowed to have a fire, all it means is you can't make a fire, but not that the fire cannot be burning in your home if it was begun before Shabbat came in. There is, however, a different take on this verse. Lo tavaru eish b'chol moshvotechem b'yom HaShabbat. You're not allowed to make a fire in all of your dwellings on the Shabbat day. And this is a Hasidic explanation. And the Hasidic explanation goes as follows. That eish here in this verse, fire, is actually referring to the fire of anger. And the Torah is saying, do not ignite, do not spark the fire of anger in all of your dwellings on the Shabbat day. That's very nice, but the question we could ask is, well, why just on Shabbat? Are you allowed to get angry the rest of the time? Doesn't the Talmud say that a person who tears his garments in anger eventually will come to serve idolatry? Because that's the way of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. To begin with, it makes you do something little, and then it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So to begin with, you're just tearing things up, and the next minute, or a few days later, you're doing a grievous sin. And as Maimonides says, that anger is a very negative trait. One should never get angry. And if you need to show people you're upset, you can make out as if you're angry, but you're not actually allowed to feel angry inside. So why would the Torah tell us, don't make the fire of anger on Shabbat? Why specifically on Shabbat? So the Hasidic interpretation continues as follows. Really, you're not allowed to get angry anytime. But the Torah is specifying Shabbat. And why is that so? Because the rest of the week, people are busy. They're involved in their jobs. And they're in the office. Or they're out on the road. Or in the days of the shtetl, they were schlepping things. And they were tired and they were exhausted. They didn't have time to have fights and arguments. They were too busy. But what happens on Shabbat? There's no work. People are relaxed. People are calm. They're sitting around the table. They're coming to shul. And because they have time on their hands, this is when arguments can begin. Two men sitting next to one another in shul. The one turns to the other one and says, did you hear what so-and-so did? Did you hear what this person did? And then eventually that person who's sitting a few pews in the front finds out that they're speaking about him. And he comes to them and he starts to argue with them. And the next minute there's a fight and there's fisticuffs and the whole thing becomes terrible. So therefore the Torah has to emphasize, specifically on Shabbat, when you are resting, when you're not overburdened with work, that's when you shouldn't become angry, because things can get out of hand. But of course you shouldn't be angry at any time. But on the contrary, Shabbat should be a time of menucha, of calmness and of peace, a time that we get together in love with our families. And that's why the greeting that we give to people is Shabbat Shalom. It should be a Shabbat of peace. Use it properly. Use that wonderful gift that Hashem gave us. Do not become angry. Do not stoke the fires of rage on the Shabbat day. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom.